Welcome back to the Daily Crypto Deep Dive. The most important crypto law in America is suddenly in serious danger, and XRP holders need to understand what happens if it does not pass. Because the Digital Asset Market Clarity Act has been presented as the legislation that could finally open the doors to American banks, investment companies, and payment providers. For XRP specifically, it could transform regulatory clarity from a court decision into permanent federal law. But time is running out. The bill has already passed the House of Representatives and cleared the Senate Banking Committee. Despite that progress, it still needs enough support to reach the Senate floor, overcome the Senate's 60-vote barrier, survive negotiations with the Senate Agriculture Committee, and then be reconciled with the version passed by the House. Prediction markets recently reduced the chances of it becoming law in 2026 to approximately 40%. That number is not a reliable forecast, but it tells us that traders no longer regard passage as virtually guaranteed. Today, we are going to separate the reality from the fear. We will examine what legal protection XRP already has, what the Clarity Act would add, what happens to institutional adoption if the bill fails, whether XRP exchange-traded funds remain possible, and what the realistic bullish, neutral, and bearish scenarios could look like. Most importantly, we will answer the question XRP holders are now asking. Would failure destroy the XRP investment case, or merely delay the next phase of it? Before we begin, Kraken remains one of the easiest places to buy and trade XRP and the other major cryptocurrencies covered on this podcast. Anyone signing up using the Kraken link in the episode description will also qualify for our 20 XRP listener giveaway. Terms and availability will depend on your location. And as always, nothing in this episode is financial advice. The first thing we need to establish is that the Clarity Act is not starting from nothing. The House of Representatives passed the legislation in July 2025 by 294 votes to 134. Importantly, 78 Democrats joined every voting Republican in supporting it, demonstrating that market structure legislation can attract bipartisan support. The Senate Banking Committee then advanced its revised version in May 2026 by 15 votes to 9. The problem is that committee approval is not the same as becoming law. Republicans do not automatically have the 60 votes normally required to end debate and move major legislation through the Senate. They need Democratic support, and several Democrats are demanding stronger ethics provisions covering politicians and senior government officials with financial interests in cryptocurrency. President Donald Trump's own involvement in crypto has made that disagreement far more difficult. His family's businesses and disclosed crypto-related income have created an obvious political attack line for opponents of the legislation. Trump reportedly met with senators in an attempt to resolve that ethics dispute, but Congress is approaching its August recess. After that, attention will increasingly move towards the midterm elections, making it more difficult to pass complicated bipartisan legislation. Other disputes remain as well. Banks and cryptocurrency companies have fought over whether platforms should be allowed to provide rewards or yield connected to stablecoins. Banks fear that attractive stablecoin rewards could pull deposits away from traditional accounts, reducing the money available for lending. The latest Senate Banking Committee text would prohibit passive, deposit-like interest on payment stablecoin balances, while still permitting genuine activity-based or transaction-based rewards under future rules. That disagreement may appear unrelated to XRP, but large legislation often fails because of disputes involving just one section. XRP could be affected by the collapse of a bill even when XRP itself is not the source of the argument. So why does the legislation matter so much to XRP? The answer is Section 105. The Senate Banking Committee's section-by-section explanation says the Securities and Exchange Commission would be prevented from determining that a digital asset is a security when a United States court had already reached the opposite conclusion in a non-appealable judgment before the law was enacted. That provision appears particularly relevant to XRP because of the result of the Ripple case. The court concluded that Ripple's direct institutional sales of XRP under written contracts constituted unregistered securities offerings. However, Ripple's programmatic sales through public exchanges did not constitute unregistered securities transactions under the circumstances examined by the court. The distinction is extremely important. The court did not declare that every possible transaction involving XRP could never be a securities transaction. Securities law often examines the way an asset is sold, the promises attached to it, and the expectations created for the buyer. But the ruling did provide XRP with something most cryptocurrencies have never received: a detailed federal court decision establishing that the token's ordinary programmatic exchange sales were not unregistered securities offerings. Ripple and the SEC ended their appeals in August 2025. Ripple's approximately $125 million penalty and the injunction covering future institutional sales remained in effect, but the exchange sales portion of the judgment was left standing. The Clarity Act could turn that judicial protection into something much harder for a future SEC administration to challenge. It would also create a wider statutory system for network tokens, ancillary assets, and digital commodities. Under the Senate text, certain network tokens could be treated as commodities while their issuers remained subject to disclosure requirements connected to fundraising and managerial involvement. This attempts to resolve one of crypto's strangest legal problems: the possibility that an investment contract can exist around a token without permanently transforming the token itself into a security. The bill would also allow qualifying projects to raise capital under a proposed exemption known as Regulation Crypto, subject to limits and continuing disclosures. It would restrict insider token sales and attempt to prevent insiders from flooding the market. For XRP, this could provide clearer boundaries between the token, Ripple's activities, and any future institutional distribution arrangements. But what happens if the bill fails? The first and most important point is that XRP does not suddenly become a security. The Ripple judgment does not disappear because Congress fails to pass a new law. The settlement does not reverse itself. Exchanges do not immediately have to delist XRP, and existing XRP products do not automatically have to close. The Rex Osprey XRP ETF is already listed on the CBOE BZX exchange, according to its June 2026 prospectus. That alone demonstrates that regulated American investment access to XRP does not depend entirely on the Clarity Act becoming law. Therefore, the immediate bearish interpretation, Clarity fails, XRP is declared illegal and American trading ends, is not supported by the existing facts. The more realistic consequence would be the continuation of a regulatory risk discount. Banks, pension managers, brokers, and major payment companies generally prefer explicit legislation over regulatory speeches, enforcement settlements, or individual court decisions. Court decisions can be narrow. Agency policies can change when administrations change. Legislation creates a more permanent operating framework. Without the Clarity Act, a bank considering an XRP-based product may still ask several questions. Which regulator supervises it? How should the token be held on the balance sheet? What disclosures are required? Can XRP be used as collateral? How should customer assets be treated during bankruptcy? Which rules apply when securities, stablecoins, and digital commodities interact inside one transaction? The Clarity Act attempts to answer many of those questions. It would clarify that banks can use digital assets and blockchain technology for activities they are already permitted to conduct, including payments, custody, lending, and trading. It would also create bankruptcy protections for customer digital commodities and require coordination between the SEC and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Failure would not make those activities impossible. It would make them slower, more expensive, and more dependent on legal advice. That distinction matters enormously. Institutions do not always avoid crypto because they believe the technology is useless. They avoid it because the compliance cost, reputational risk, and possibility of a future enforcement action outweigh the expected return. Removing uncertainty could reduce that institutional risk premium. Failing to remove it leaves the premium in place. This is also why the Clarity Act cannot guarantee a particular XRP price. You will see predictions claiming that passage sends XRP to $5, $10, $30, or considerably higher. Those forecasts assume that legal clarity immediately produces large-scale bank adoption and investment inflows. But legislation does not force banks to use XRP. It does not force payment providers to source liquidity through the token. It does not guarantee that Ripple wins contracts, that XRP ledger activity grows, or that investment funds allocate billions of dollars. The bill would remove a barrier. It would not manufacture demand by itself. Ledger is also linked in the episode description for anyone looking to move long-term cryptocurrency holdings away from an exchange and into self-custody. The realistic outlook can be divided into 3 scenarios. The bullish scenario is that senators reach an ethics compromise. The different committee texts are combined, and the legislation passes in 2026. In that case, XRP could receive an immediate sentiment boost because one of its largest remaining risks would have been reduced. More importantly, American financial institutions would have a clearer framework for custody, trading, payments, and tokenized assets. That could support a longer-term valuation expansion, but sustained price growth would still require genuine capital inflows and increased use of the XRP ledger. The neutral scenario is that the bill misses the 2026 deadline but returns in a future Congress. Under that outcome, XRP may initially sell off because traders had positioned for passage. The market hates delayed catalysts, particularly when investors have spent months pricing them in. However, XRP would retain its existing court judgment, exchange availability, regulated investment products, and international use cases. The fundamental story would be delayed rather than destroyed. This may actually be the most realistic downside scenario. The bearish scenario would require more than one failed vote. It would involve the legislation collapsing, political control changing, future regulators adopting a more hostile interpretation of crypto, and institutions deciding that the unresolved legal environment is not worth entering. Even then, any new attack on XRP would have to confront the completed Ripple litigation and the existing treatment of secondary exchange sales. The legal landscape is not the same as it was when the SEC originally sued Ripple in December 2020. The greatest threat would therefore be stagnation rather than immediate prohibition. XRP could remain tradable and operational while failing to receive the institutional revaluation holders expect. It could continue behaving primarily as a speculative crypto asset instead of developing into a widely used settlement and liquidity instrument. That is the risk holders should examine honestly. The XRP investment case cannot depend entirely on one piece of legislation. It must ultimately depend on liquidity, transaction volume, integration, developer activity, tokenization, and institutions choosing to use the network. There is also a broader point. If the Clarity Act fails, the United States will not stop blockchain development around the rest of the world. Europe, Asia, and the Middle East will continue building regulatory frameworks. Ripple can continue operating internationally, and the XRP ledger remains a global public network rather than an American company's private database. But America remains the world's deepest capital market. Permanent American rules could unlock investment, banking relationships, and product distribution on a scale that is difficult for another jurisdiction to reproduce. That is why the bill matters, even though XRP can survive without it. So what should XRP holders watch next? Do not focus solely on prediction market percentages. Watch whether senators announce an agreement on government ethics, whether leadership schedules actual Senate floor time, and whether the banking and agriculture committee versions can be combined. Those are more meaningful signals than political promises or social media claims that passage is guaranteed. The final conclusion is relatively straightforward. Failure of the Clarity Act would be disappointing for XRP. It could produce a short-term price decline, delay institutional adoption, and preserve the regulatory uncertainty that has followed the industry for years. But it would not erase the Ripple judgment, automatically classify XRP as a security, or end XRP trading in the United States. The most realistic result would be delay. And while delay can be painful for investors, it is fundamentally different from defeat. XRP has already survived the full force of an SEC lawsuit, exchange delistings, years of appeals, and repeated claims that the project was finished. The Clarity Act could accelerate the next stage of XRP's development. But XRP's future still has to be earned through adoption, liquidity, and real utility, whether Congress acts this summer or not. Thank you very much for listening. Like and follow, and as always, we will see you at the top.